There was a spy committee on every block. We had whisper inside our own house.
We don't have a sense of communism and the actual effects it has on actual human beings.
There was a lot of violence.
And so your parents are watching all this happen, and then the opportunity comes up for them to send their sons away. The idea was that the parents could follow, right? That didn't always happen.
Well, it became impossible.
You wrote that a series of events made me a very religious person, and you said this faith is what saved me.
When we left Cuba, we were only allowed to take one book. It changed my life. There was so much nastiness around me.
Looking at America, which has been your home for most of your life now, you mentioned that you see some kind of chilling or concerning signs.
Well, yes. I get this very, very disturbing sense of deja vu.
Welcome to Edify. In 1962, when Carlos Eire and his older brother were airlifted out of Cuba to the United States in Operation Pedro Pan, they were amazed at the force of liftoff. Carlos left behind a Cuba that had succumbed to the communist revolution, and he flew into a new world. Against impossible odds, he went on to become a respected scholar and historian, now at a chair at Yale University. His latest book examines other flyers. It is titled They Flew, A History of the Impossible, and examines how testimonies of levitation and bilocation abounded in the early modern age and challenged the hard lines that man was drawing between the natural and the supernatural. This is going to be a wild conversation. I'm very excited. Welcome, Professor Eire.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be here.
Well, we were just chatting before we got the recording going here about your childhood in Cuba, and I'd kind of like to start there with your personal story. Your memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, came out many years ago now, but it talks about your experience of the pre-Castro world that you were born into. Can you tell us a little bit about that time?
Yes, well, it was the 1950s. I was born in 1950, exactly. And my entire childhood was spent in a very turbulent culture and society because we had a dictator as president, and there was a lot of violence. There are many nights when I went to sleep to the sound of gunfire and bombs going off in the distance. But Cuba was a very prosperous country in the 1950s. It was unlike the rest of Latin America. It had one of, or maybe the largest middle class in Latin America, and the highest per capita income. So it was not third world. Yes, there was poverty. Every country has poverty. The poverty was worse in the countryside. And since I never left Havana, I never saw the rest of the island. I don't know what it was like, but the situation was such that, I went to Catholic schools, but by 1959, that world ended very abruptly. And it changed very, very, very fast. So that actually, the first school I attended, my parents took me out and sent me to a different Catholic school run by the same order, the Christian Brothers. But there was already a great deal of hostility to anyone who was middle class or higher. So he sent us to a quote unquote poorer school.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So that we would experience less harassment, but that didn't work. By 1961, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, the communist dictatorship took over all the schools, closed down all the Catholic schools, all private schools, and established an education system that was basically indoctrination, brainwashing of all sorts. And that's when my parents decided to send us, my brother and me, to the United States because they didn't want us being indoctrinated. And they also feared that we might end up in jail because neither my brother nor I could keep our mouths shut. So,
a natural talker.
Well, we just said what was in our heads, and you're not allowed to do that in Cuba. Mm-hmm. And increasingly so, we're not allowed to do that here in this country either.
It's true.
I get this very, very disturbing sense of deja vu. You know, I've seen this before. It's very similar.
And in particular, when you talk about getting that sense of deja vu, you were a young child, obviously, with a child's perspective, but what were some of the key changes that you saw when Castro drove into Havana there before you left, other than the indoctrination, obviously, of the children?
It was a very concerted effort to assume control of all expression, even within your own house. There was a spy committee on, at least in the cities, a spy committee per block. Every block had one. And we were lucky enough to get it right next door to us. So to have conversations that, you know, dealt with the issue of all the increased repression, we had to shut our windows and whisper inside our own house so that we wouldn't be heard. And we heard of people being arrested for just saying the wrong thing. And there's one famous case. There's one Cuban, Armando Valladares, who was asked a question at work, and he gave an honest answer about the way things were going, and he spent over 20 years in prison just for saying the wrong thing.
Just for saying it, yeah.
He wrote a prison memoir, which has been translated into English, and I highly recommend. The title of it is Against All Hope. And he details what the prison system was like. Mm-hmm. I had an uncle who was arrested and tortured, a cousin who was arrested and tortured, and another who was executed, another cousin. So they meant business, and you knew that they meant business. This story tells you how cruel the system could be. My uncle, my father's brother, was arrested when the Bay of Pigs invasion landed. His son, my cousin, Fernando, was already in prison. So they put both of them in the same prison. And my uncle says that just about every morning, they'd wake him up, the guards would wake him up and say, when you hear the shots going off outside, that's your son we're executing. And they did it every day. And my cousin was taken to a firing squad various times and shot with blanks. Oh. Yeah. They had trouble actually getting rid of him, executing him, because he had been born in Spain and was considered a Spanish citizen.
Why had he been arrested in the first place?
He was smuggling weapons for the counter-insurgency. And they stopped him for missing a red light, searched the car. That was it. That was
the end.
Yep.
So your parents, I'm trying, as a mother of young children, I have, a boy who was your age when you left. I'm trying to imagine your parents watching this happen and thinking, what am I going to do with my children who can't keep their mouths shut, as you put it? And yes. Sooner or later, they'll say something. And were you considered upper class? I mean, your father was a judge, right?
My father was a judge. We were considered upper middle class.
Okay.
Not upper class. I was one of the poorest kids at my school. I actually had as a classmate a son of the richest family in Cuba. But we lived in a very modest house, and Cuban style, a large family. And actually, the house actually belonged to my father's sister, who didn't belong to him. And his sister lived there, his mother, and his aunt. And they passed away. The older ones passed away when I was a child, but it was a very crowded, modest house with 4 bedrooms.
Mm-hmm. But you still would have been targeted by the Castro regime.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And so your parents are watching all this happen to your family members, and the schools are being shut down. And then the opportunity comes up for them to send their sons away. Can you tell us a little bit about Operation Peter Pan, which was not a federal operation here in the United States, right? It was, I believe, a Catholic priest began it.
It was hybrid because Monsignor Walsh, an Irish priest, born in Ireland, but living here in the U.S., was a priest of the Archdiocese of Miami. And he saw that many kids were arriving by themselves, or that the families, once they arrived, had problems and they broke up, and there were a lot of loose kids. So it's a very long story, but he had connections. He arranged for the U.S. State Department to grant him permission, carte blanche. You can distribute as many visa waivers as Cubans need for children. Now, children could get visa waivers because they don't need security clearances. Parents, much longer process. So that's the reason that the airlift began, is that by word of mouth, very quickly, this began around Christmas 1961. Between Christmas 1961 and the missile crisis of October 1962, 14,000 children left through this program, which was administered, since most Cubans were Catholic, 80-some% of the kids were taken care of by the Catholic Church. But Protestant churches also kicked in, and some secular institutions, because, among those 14,000 kids, there were Catholics, Protestants, Chinese, and Jews, and an assortment of other nationalities. But when the program ended abruptly, the door was closed in October of 62. There were 80,000 other children who had visa waivers waiting to leave.
Wow. And they were stuck.
And there were kids who didn't leave through this program. It's estimated that if everyone had left who wanted to leave, it would have been over 100,000 kids.
Wow. And when the program was shut down after Bay of Pigs, the idea was that the parents could follow, right?
That's
that
right.
Eventually your parents would follow, but that didn't always happen, or did it become more difficult?
Well, it became impossible for a while. Nobody knows the exact percentage, but about half of the 14,000 kids, or more than half, their parents were trapped in Cuba. Same thing that happened to mine. I ended up never seeing my father again because he couldn't leave. He wasn't allowed to leave. And then my mom arrived 3.5 years later.
Wow.
So for 3.5 years, my brother and I bounced around a bit, including 9 delightful months in a home for juvenile delinquents. This shows you how complicated this was. It was kind of well-organized chaos. My first foster family was Jewish Americans, and they had to sign a document that they were not trying to convert me. And they forced me to go to church every Sunday.
To Catholic Mass.
To Catholic Mass, St. Brendan's Church in Miami, and gave me money to put in the collection plate.
Oh.
And my stepfather, wonderful person. I loved him. He was an atheist. So how ironic is that?
You actually, I was going to read this. You wrote that a series of events made me a very religious person. This was in an interview, I believe, you gave about the book. And you said, "This faith is what saved me. One of the big differences between my brother and me is that my brother lost his faith. I would not have survived without it." What were some of those events that gave you the ability to hold on to your faith?
Yeah, well, even at the home for juvenile delinquents, there was another guy who would go to Mass with my brother and me. And occasionally the house mother, who was not a very nice person, occasionally she'd drive us to a church in downtown Miami. But the real change for me came when I was living at my uncle's house in Bloomington, Illinois. That's where my brother and I ended up with him. And I used to get panic attacks. And these panic attacks were very specific. It was a feeling of being totally alone in the world. And if I ever came home and the house was empty, I would go into a panic. So all of my childhood, I had been really scared by religion. And to be specific, I was scared by Spanish Catholicism. And to me, there was no scarier place than a church. Those images, they just, and the whole crucifixion thing, I was terrified. But then I started to figure out that, it wasn't church that was scary. It's the world that was scary. And, American crucifixes are a lot more restrained than Spanish crucifixes.
They're very sanitized.
So that helped. That helped a lot. So I started reading a book that my parents had given me. When we left Cuba, we were only allowed to take one book, and my parents picked which book it would be. And it was The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis.
For their 11-year-old son, their little boy.
Yes, because there was this, I don't know if it was Spanish or tradition or Cuban tradition, kind of like Protestants do with the Bible. I was told by my mom, whenever you're having a hard time over there in the United States, just open this book at random and you'll find comfort.
Yes.
Or an answer to your problems. Well, every time I opened that book, it scared me to death.
It scares me too. It's an intimidating book.
It's all about becoming selfless, about just abandoning everything.
Yes.
It worked for me. Gradually, very gradually, it worked for me. I let go of everything that had happened to me and started not just believing that the religion I had grown up with was true. It was really true. There is a God. There is Jesus. And I felt their presence at times. And then the rest is, I became very, very, very religious through high school, especially. It changed my life. There was so much nastiness around me, so much poverty, so much work. I actually worked full time my freshman year of high school.
Wow.
And then worked 30 hours a week for the remaining 3 years of high school. And I got a sense of mission when I was a sophomore in high school, that I was born to teach.
That's your mission.
And born to teach history. So at first I thought I'd be a high school teacher because that's all I knew. But once I got to college, I said, "Oh no, this is it. This is what I need to do."
So you kept going.
I kept going. I majored. I went to Loyola University, Chicago, which was only 6 blocks from our apartment. And it was on my way to work on the elevated train line.
On the L.
Perfect.
Yep.
It's the only school I applied to. I got in, I got scholarships. I didn't have to pay tuition. And I majored in theology and history. And later on, I decided, yeah, this is it for me. I'll get a PhD.
So keep going.
And that's what I did. But when my mom told me shortly before she died, she started to tell me things I didn't know. And she said, when you went off to Yale, or were about to go off to graduate school, my friends did an intervention.
That's what my friends would do if one of my kids went to Yale.
Well, they just descended on her. Apparently, they said, you can't let Carlos waste his life this way. Yeah, he's too. What's he going to do? He's not going to be a priest. What's he going to do with a religion degree? He should do something practical. He should be an accountant. But she said, God bless her. She said, that's what he wants to do. Mm-hmm. And it was in many ways painful for me to go to graduate school in some other location and leave my mom and brother behind. I thought I would end up getting a job in Chicago, but no, my entire career until I came to Yale, not a single job opened up in my area of expertise in the Chicago area. Mm-hmm. So
you've been all over, and now you've settled in Connecticut.
Yes.
Yes. I want to go back a little bit to what you said. In so many ways, your story is the embodiment of the American dream, right? That people talk about. You come here as a boy with nothing, a refugee from a communist regime, and you grow through. Looking at America, which has been your home for most of your life now, you mentioned that you see some kind of chilling or concerning signs. Could you outline some of those for us? What do you see?
Well, yes. Top of the list is control of language and thought. And, I learned this from one of the founders of social science, Emil Durkheim, who came up with this concept of social facts. What's a social fact? Social fact is a way of thinking that governs people's behavior. It's a fact in the sense that it becomes real, and it becomes so real that if you deny that fact, you can be punished. Mm-hmm. So our present day control of language and expression is one of these social facts. There are words you cannot say. There are thoughts you cannot express without instantly being labeled as evil in some way, or even dangerous. And you can't question certain things, that, like, for instance, God help you if you speak against the transitioning of very, very young kids to another sex. And I'll give you one example, more immediate, not mine, but a student here at Yale, she's brilliant. Yeah, she worked for the pro-life movement, and she went to the Yale Women's Center. She needed some kind of medical help for some issue. Mm-hmm. They threw her out.
They threw her out?
Yep, they wouldn't help her because she was pro-life.
Just because of who she was?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And another student, I heard the story from a student about another student, that they were discussing what their summer plans were. And this student, a woman, she said, well, I'm going to work with a mission in South America for the summer. And she got very viciously attacked on social media for doing something so wrong. So these things just frighten me to know. And so control of thought, control of speech, the very concerted attempt that we are undergoing to destroy the nuclear family, to do everything possible to make it no longer a standard for the way in which people should live. And there are other social programs that are just, this whole thing about equity and the redistribution of wealth, that's communism.
Right. It's Marxist, communist.
Yes. And
right.
I think it's very ironic that I often, when I do public speaking on Cuba, the very first question I get is usually, how much property did your family own? Because that instantly makes me an evil person and disqualifies anything I have to say about Cuba or communism. Because I owned stuff, I'm a bad person.
Wow.
And when in
part
fact,
of the bourgeois.
Yeah. And I had the chance some years ago here at Yale. A speaker was invited who had been one of Fidel Castro's closest associates, but he was purged and ended up in exile. But he came here to speak, and I got to sit next to him at dinner. And I asked him about the airlift. You guys knew what was going on. Why did you let all the kids leave and then shut the door on the parents? And he said with a big smile on his face, and he was very proud of this, because anything that would destroy the bourgeois family was wonderful.
Wow. That's chilling.
Yep. But that's what I see happening here, unfortunately. And in Europe, too, Western Europe, in some places worse than us.
Thinking about, I've had this conversation with Catholics who are more of a more progressive bent or a leftist leaning about communism. And I think that Americans, we don't have a sense of the evils of communism and the actual effects that it has on actual human beings. And a lot of Catholics I would speak to say things like, well, capitalism is based on greed and communism is based on sharing. So it's actually more Christian because the rich should want to pay their fair share. And if they don't, they should be made to pay their fair share. This is one of the lines of the Biden administration, right?
Right.
That would be forcing a kind of Christian virtue onto society. And so that aspect of communism, Catholics should embrace because it's what Jesus taught. And how would you even begin to untangle that kind of understanding of communism?
Yeah, here's what I say when I hear an argument like that. Yes, communism is Christian, and monks and nuns are communists, right? And that's a level of perfection in the Christian life that people have to willingly commit to. Right? They commit to sharing. The problem with a government that insists that everyone must share is that it doesn't work. Because people who are not devoted to God and to selflessness for the sake of Christian perfection, they can share, and it kind of works, sometimes it doesn't. But when you force people to become basically monks and nuns, it just doesn't work because not everybody has that vocation. An example is the Hutterite Church. It's an Anabaptist. They're descended from the Anabaptist tradition, and they live like Catholic monks and nuns. They share property. But they marry and have children. But Hutterites can be very successful at farming as communists. But again, that's voluntary. Anyone who doesn't want to share gets kicked out of the community. It's that simple. And that's what happens in communist states. And what most Americans don't realize is that there is no right or left, right? Communism and fascism, any kind of totalitarianism, are equally evil. And actually, communism has killed more people than the Nazis ever did. The problem is original sin. Here I'm going to get a little theological, right?
Go for it.
Because as Augustine instructed everyone who came after him, we're damaged goods, we human beings. And we're governed by self-interest, by cupiditas, which is, love of self. That's why in his City of God, he put it off into eschatological, apocalyptic terms. Only when Christ returns and humanity is totally healed of selfishness will the City of God exist on earth. And without an economic system in which people feel that their effort will be rewarded, things fall apart. And that's what happens. All anybody has to do is take a look at Cuba, Venezuela, but Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world.
Right.
And communism has turned it very quickly into a third world hellhole.
Yeah, I think for me, that's the great mystery of it all, that we have the receipts, right, from the Soviet Union. We have the receipts from Cuba. We see what happened in Venezuela very similarly, very quickly overnight, going from the fourth richest country in the world to one of the poorest. I think the poverty level there is 75% now. And yet in the United States, there continues to be this sort of obsession with this utopian promise that communism and socialism offer, and that mystique. What is the power of the communist mystique that we can, again and again, we keep trying the same thing?
It's nice. I mean, as a Christian, one is obligated to believe and say that, what happened in the first generation of the Christian church described in the Acts of the Apostles is ideal.
Yes.
It's ideal, but not everyone can do that, which is, let's all share and share alike, but it never works. It never works.
And
there's plenty
so
of proof. This is why Catholic religious orders, most of them, have had to undergo reforms repeatedly because the sharing business starts to deteriorate. And the only order that claims it has never needed a reform are the Carthusians.
But aren't they a reform of an earlier order?
Yes. Yeah. They're an attempt to get away from corrupt monasticism.
Yeah.
So just look at the history of monasticism. There's one failure after another. The good end of that story is that, eventually most of them reform themselves and go back to being what they are. But the sharing business doesn't work. And people who go to communes, not religious, they encounter all sorts of problems too. Right.
The ideals of youth are quickly thwarted by human nature, fallen nature. So to kind of segue now, speaking of reforms, I think you've done a lot of work on Teresa of Avila, right? One of the great reformers of the Carmelite movement. And she's an example that you use in, I think, one of my favorite books of yours that's about these phenomena of bilocation and levitation. So they flew. and you're looking at what's impossible. Now, I was reading a few reviews. One of my favorite accused you of being silly, a silly man, for even examining this question of the impossible, because I think it's a social fact, to speak of social facts, right?
Right.
That these things are impossible. That is a social fact.
That's right.
So I guess just tell me a little bit about that project of challenging the social fact, because I think your book does a little bit. You go beyond just sort of examining, this is what this testimony said and this is what that testimony said, and you sort of take off the brackets. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those brackets are that we place on miracles, where they came from, and how you try to get beyond them?
Yes. Well, every major world religion and even tribal religions believe in miracles of some kind, right? But more basic fact, they believe that this world we live in, this material world, this earth we live in, is not all there is to reality. That there's another reality that in the Western culture ends up being called supernatural. There's something above, higher, that actually makes our world kind of less real than that other realm. And for Christians, and especially for Catholics, supernatural power interacts with nature. That's what the seven sacraments are in Catholic theology, right? You use material things like water, oil, and bread and wine, and all of a sudden, poof, the natural world is suffused with supernatural. So when Protestant Reformation came along in the 16th century, the leading reformers of the first and second generation, and in some cases after the second generation, argued that miracles had ceased at the end of the apostolic age. Another way of putting it is, Jesus gave his 12 apostles power to perform miracles, but that was temporary. And when Apostle John, the last one to die, died, miracles stopped happening. Now, why would they say this? The New Testament is full of miracles. The Old Testament is full of miracles. Why would they have to stop? Well, there's a polemical reason, very practical reason for raising this argument, which is the Catholic Church would say, look, we are the true church. Look how many miracles we have. And the Protestants said, no, those are not miracles. Those are demonic tricks. Everything that you claim is a miracle was done by the devil. And there's also a factor of, increasing secularism from the late Middle Ages to the 16th century. Yes, skepticism, because miracles are rare, right? And miracles don't happen too often. And sometimes, as was the case in the late Middle Ages, sometimes miracles were faked. Mm-hmm. They'd put little pipes behind inside the head of an image, and then the image would cry. It's known. That's a fact. So the brackets, beginning in the 19th century, is the Protestant argument known as the cessation of miracles took over on the intellectual realm. It became the norm to not deal with the miracles themselves as events, but rather as, social constructs. And all you could do is analyze the function that these miracles serve, that this outrageously stupid belief, right, served for anybody, because it's all outrageously stupid.
And why is it stupid? Like, what is it about the modern age that, because they're not Protestants anymore, right? Like, they're not even Christian anymore, but they still see it stupid. They say it's stupid.
Because science can't prove any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Modern science is the only window we have into reality. When people are miraculously healed, it's a fluke of nature. We don't know. We can't explain it, but, it happens. So I chose 2 miracles that accompany mystical ecstasy, which I thought were the 2 most impossible miracles, given our culture and given what my profession taught me, right? Levitation, which is, being suspended in the air, and bilocation, being in 2 places simultaneously. And we have thousands of accounts of this happening in not just Christian history, but world history. My colleagues who do Asian religions, whenever I told them when I was working on this book what I was doing, they'd say, yeah, so what? Of course. Of course. That's what happens.
That's what happens.
So I chose these 2 miracles because they're impossible. And I chose the time period specifically because it's the birth of the age of science. And the Catholic Church was changing its method of affirming and proving miracles in a scientific way. So to cut to the chase, 2 of these reviews that I've seen accuse me of being insincere because obviously I must believe, I must know with great certainty that any testimony about levitation or bilocation is a lie. And all the eyewitnesses are liars, or they're crazy, right? They're either lying or they're deluded. Mm-hmm. So these 2 reviewers assumed that I know that I'm just adding another lie on top of all the other lies.
Because they couldn't imagine that you were even open to the possibility.
That's right.
These things were true.
I'm insincere, and I'm a liar. And that's why one of them said my book is deeply unserious. But here's the deal, and I wish I had explained it better in the book. This caught me by surprise. The testimonies I'm relying on come mostly from beatification and canonization inquests, which were reformed in the 16th century, and even more reformed in the 17th. And here's how you get these testimonies. A questionnaire is developed for each saint to be. And there's a whole set of questions about miracles. It's presented to eyewitnesses, people who knew the saint. And they have to swear on pain of spending eternity in hell that they're telling the truth. Mm-hmm. It's like a court of law, except in a court of law, you get accused of perjury, you spend time in prison. In the case of these very, very religious Catholics who are answering the questionnaire, the risk is they'll end up in hell.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. Are they all going to lie when this is one of their central beliefs? So I say, as a historian, you have to do the same thing they do in a court of law and look at the credibility of the eyewitness. And that's all I'm doing, is I'm looking at the credibility of these eyewitnesses. And thousands of monks, nuns, and priests and, devout Catholics tell the same lies. And okay, fine, maybe they won't end up in hell because of forgiveness and, the sacrament of penance. But they would know that they're risking a long stay in purgatory. Right?
And they sincerely believe in purgatory and hell. Right.
That's right. Yes.
Right.
So that adds to their credibility, I think, in a way that these critics refuse to acknowledge.
Yeah. To me, the criticisms the reactions to your book were really revelatory of the lack of imagination I see in the modern academy, and just the inability of, and I experienced this too. I went through graduate school in philosophy and down at Emory, and the lack of an ability to put yourself in the shoes of thinkers from a diversity, to use a buzzword, a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of time periods. It was sort of a hallmark of the Western mind at this point. And I know that the word disenchantment, reenchantment of the world has been thrown around in our circle. Hans Boersma, Rod Dreher, for a more popular sort of author who goes into this. Do you see your work in this area as a part of inviting people to a reenchantment, to a rediscovery of wonder at the world, or the possibility that the line between the natural and supernatural is not so absolute?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not a scientist. I read as a layperson. I read about discoveries being made in science. And I know that at the subatomic level and at the cosmic level, physics, the experts not only admit that they don't know what's going on, but are actually positing in a scientific way the existence of multiple universes, multiple dimensions, right? So that puts us right back where the ancients were. Plato, the Greek philosopher, perhaps best known for proposing that our world that we live in is but a poor reflection of a higher reality. And that's not Christian necessarily, but it becomes Christian. It fits in very nicely with the Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And 2 years ago, I think it was, two scientific teams from Cambridge University in the UK and Caltech in Pasadena conducted an experiment to see if they could prove that our world was a simulation. and what they discovered was, of course, no, it's not a simulation. It's real. In Christian theology, paradox is central to everything. And there's this admission that, look, our brains are ultimately incapable of discerning higher, more complex truths that belong only to the divine, to God. So we are simultaneously, I think, a kind of simulation. And I don't have the theological language for, converting this to the theology. But yeah, the material world, as Jesus points out repeatedly in every gospel, is not it. That's not it.
So you teach one of the most popular courses that I've heard at Yale University called the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. And you're currently teaching this class again. What is it like? There are Catholic students at Yale. I go to St. Mary's, and we see converts coming from Yale every year. So there's obviously still the faith can survive there. But I would imagine most of your students come from a world that of thought, of education, that is disenchanted, that is more, has all the brackets on. What is it like teaching the Catholic intellectual tradition? How did you construct that course? And what is it like teaching it to students who maybe have been taught there is that hard line between natural and supernatural?
Yeah. It's I have been teaching this course now. I think this is the 13th year in a row. And I have to say that every single year I meet these remarkable students. Because this is not a course that anybody has to take. It's, purely elective. So who do I end up getting there? I get all sorts of different individuals. But they're curious. That's it. They have some kind of curiosity about the subject. And not all of them are Catholic. As a matter of fact, I think maybe the majority are not. But there are also seekers, I call them. They're seeking knowledge about religion, about these propositions. You know, I've heard a few colleagues kind of ridicule the title of the course. Oh, Catholic intellectual tradition, isn't that a contradiction in terms? Little do they know.
Yeah. You say you should take the course and find out.
Yeah, well, and we go through 20 centuries, so it's a hop, skip, and a jump. I wish it could be a 2-semester course, but then it wouldn't have the same enrollment because students commit just for one course on this subject. I doubt very much that they would commit two courses on the same subject. It's an introduction, and you know the Catholic students that come forward to me and identify themselves as Catholic, some of them have gone to Catholic school K through 12, and they've never read any of the texts assigned in the course.
That's embarrassing.
And you know, they just don't. They went through some kind of wishy-washy Catholic
light.
Catholic light, ultra light, actually, in some cases. But I also get seekers who, come forward to me and say, I'm thinking of joining the Catholic Church. I just want to know more. But I had a student, he's in the class this year, came up to me and identified himself as Muslim. And he said, yeah, last year I took the Buddhism course, and now I'm taking the Catholicism. I just want to find out about these other religions, which I think is marvelous. Mm-hmm. And something happened to me the first year I taught the course, which was a surprise, was that at first the students were very reticent to speak during discussion sections. Mm. And but there was one student who actually did most of the talking. So I asked her, please tell me what's your take on what's going on here? Why are your classmates so quiet? And her answer just knocked me off my feet. And I think she was correct. She said, because they have never, ever had to speak about God in a classroom.
Is there a work that is sort of a perennial favorite among students or sparks the most conversation in the class?
Well, there are peaks and valleys. Yes, there are peaks and valleys. And some of the early Christian fathers, and that's what we're dealing with this week and next week. The mystics, Dante, and then as we move forward in time, the social issues, the way in which the Catholic Church began to engage with social issues, the conquest of the New World and exploitation of the natives, the Industrial Revolution, Rerum Novarum.
Oh, one of my favorites.
It is just astounding. Mm-hmm. But by the time we get there, they're all worn out. It's the end of the semester.
Finals are coming.
So Rerum Novarum is perfect because it's so short.
Yes. Yeah.
And Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, they like them too. Yeah.
That's great. Do you have a favorite levitation or bilocation story that you came across in your preparing for the book in life?
Oh, there are so many.
Yes.
There are so many. But there's, Teresa of Avila begged God to stop doing this to her during her ecstasies. And she actually instructed her nuns, because she was the superior, if you see me going up, hold me down. Try to hold me down. So they tried repeatedly and failed. And one time she went up, she was in the kitchen cooking with a frying pan. She had the last little bit of oil that in the convent, right? So she didn't want to, nobody wanted to see that oil spilled. So these nuns are trying to pull Teresa down with a frying pan in her hand, and they're worried about,
the oil.
The oil.
And she's in ecstasy.
Yeah. So, but then there's at the other end of the spectrum, this is what convinces me that, the cessation of miracles Protestant argument is bizarre, because Protestants continued to believe that the devil could do these things to people, make them levitate, make people imagine that they're bilocating or something. So I ran into a narrative from 1693, Boston, Puritans, a girl who is demonically possessed, and she's in bed, and she starts to go up, just like in the movie The Exorcist. And there were several men in the room, including Cotton Mather, one of the leading churchmen of Boston, all Puritans, all Protestants. They try to hold her down, just like the nuns with Teresa, and they can't. And then when she hits the ceiling, they try to pull her down, and they can't. And Cotton Mather made these men sign affidavits that this had, in fact, happened.
Wow.
So, of course, my detractors would say, oh, they're all lying, of course. Anybody can sign an affidavit. Yeah. Okay, fine. All right. But the fact that it's irresistible, this levitation.
Wow.
And bilocation, the most interesting person I have run into and didn't have time or space to deal with her in the book, is a 20th century nun, Yvonne Aimée de Malestroit, French. Over 800 documented bilocations.
Wow, I've never heard of her. That's amazing.
Yeah, none of the literature on her has been translated into English. Oh. I find it just amazing. But anyway, she's bilocated to prisons and concentration camps during the Nazi occupation.
Wow.
And saved many people. And not only that, in addition, she and her nuns helped resistance fighters, Jews, and downed Allied pilots to escape France, Nazi-occupied France, by dressing them as nuns. And most of them managed to escape. And she was decorated with, I don't know how many medals, but 2 of the highest medals any French person can get. And one of them was pinned on her by Charles de Gaulle.
Wow.
So you've got this nun who's, in both dimensions, she is fighting Nazis.
That's amazing. I'm going to make it my life's mission now to go and find someone who can translate all these stories about her into English, because that's amazing. And I've never heard of that. Wow.
Well, there are some YouTube videos in English with subtitles.
All right. I am going to go look this up. Note to self, note to all the producers. We're going to go look her up, find a picture. All right. Well, Professor Eire, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you and to hear your stories, both about yourself and about other impossibles. And we wish you all the best.
It's been a delightful interview. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.